You are listening to the New Book of Daniel podcast. Are you ready for a bold statement? Well, here's one. We don't have systemic racism in the United States. Yes, pockets of racist people exist, but you know what? America's being deceived, and legacy media is insisting that America has institutional racism. But people of color who've lived in multiple countries report that America is the least racist country they know. No, what we're seeing now in this violence in the streets is not about racism. It's about a broad difference in cultures and worldview. And that's what we'll be talking about on today's New Book of Daniel podcast. Hello and welcome to the New Book of Daniel podcast. My name is Daniel Bobinski, and I will be your host on this adventure. On today's show, we're going to be talking about worldviews, the competing worldviews that are creating the clashes of violence that we're seeing all over our media screens. And to start off, I want to talk about what is a worldview. And my wife and I developed a curriculum that we've been teaching for about 6 or 7 years now on worldview and how one develops a worldview and what comprises a worldview. And you can define a worldview or somebody's worldview based on how they answer certain questions. And there's 10 of them that we're going to use here. And the first one is about theology. What does one believe about God? And then there's philosophy. What's real? And then biology. How did life come to be? Psychology. What's the nature of man? Ethics. How do we determine right and wrong? Sociology is what's necessary social structure. And law, how do we determine which laws to establish? Then there's politics, who makes the laws and who enforces those laws. And then economics, how do we manage and exchange the goods and services we have? And then finally, history, how do we view past, present, and future events? Now, those people who hold a Judeo-Christian worldview, the ones who founded our country, they're going to answer those questions a certain way. But what we see in the streets today is not Judeo-Christian worldview. We're seeing Marxists out in the street as defined by Black Lives Matter's own website. And from Antifa's website, they are Marxists and they answer those questions very differently. Let's start off by taking a look at the Judeo-Christian worldview. If you go to the National Archives, you're going to find a letter written by John Adams to Thomas Jefferson. And in that letter, he's talking about what unified the representatives from the 13 colonies. This is just a piece of that letter. Adams writes, "The general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the only principles in which that beautiful assembly of young gentlemen can unite. And these principles only could be intended by them in their address or by me in my answer." And what were these general principles? I answer, the general principles of Christianity, in which all those sects were united. And the general principles of English and American liberty, in which all those young men united, and which had united all parties in America in majorities sufficient to assert and maintain her independence. Now, he's using some phrases there that we commonly don't use today, but those phrases like sects, those sects were united, he's talking about like denominations. Each of the states back then pretty much had their own denominational dwellings. You had the Presbyterians or the Congregationalists or the Quakers or the Baptists, and they pretty much had their own settlements, if you will. But they all came together under the general principles of Christianity. Let's also quote from John Jay. John Jay, in case you don't know, was the president of the Continental Congress. He's the first governor of New York, and he was appointed by George Washington to be the first Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court. So you'd think he knows a little bit about our law and the Constitution. And Jay was writing a letter to Jedediah Morse, who was compiling a history of the American Revolution. And Jay wrote, "Providence has given to our people the choice of their rulers, and it's the duty as well as the privilege and interest of our Christian nation to select and prefer Christians for their rulers. So those who would argue, by the way, separation of church and state do not understand the founding, and they don't understand that the phrase separation of church and state was taken out of a private letter from Thomas Jefferson and taken out of context to make the Supreme Court ruling that we had 75, 80 years ago. So anyways, that's not what this podcast is about, but we could talk about that. My purpose in all of this is just to point out that our founders had Judeo-Christian worldview. They answered those 10 questions a certain way. I mean, even all those religious sects are still going to answer those questions very similarly. But when you take a look at Antifa and Black Lives Matter, you see a very different story. And the Washington Times had an article about this recently, and they quoted the National Security Council staff member, Richard Higgins, who was also with the Pentagon's Irregular Warfare section. And he said, the ideology of Antifa is, at its core, Marxist-Leninism. He also said Antifa's goal is nothing less than fomenting revolution, civil war, and silencing America's anti-communists. So, you know, you're against communists, communism, we need to silence you. He also goes on to talk about how Antifa was derived from a communist international organization in 1933 and was directed by Soviet-led Communist Party USA. And it was patterned after Germany's anti-fascist action, which was also called Antifa back in 1932. Testifying in Congress in 1953, the CPUSA's leader, Manning Johnson, said that the goal of Antifa was not abolishing fascism, but rather, quote, the subversion and subsequent overthrow of the United States. So here we have Antifa, and you take a look at their list of demands on their website. They do not align with a Judeo-Christian worldview. People want to move to America from all over the world. I've been to 17 countries, and everywhere I go, people want to move to America. Not because of the Antifa value system. And then when you go to Black Lives Matter's website, they also have a very Marxist worldview in their list of demands. In fact, one of their leaders, Patrice Cullors, she's got on videotape, and I linked to this, by the way, in an article over at uncoverdc.com, where she is telling her interviewer that BLM's leaders are, quote, trained Marxists, her words. So these organizations, Antifa and Black Lives Matter, they're not hiding the fact that they're Marxists. It's right out there. But we do have the media putting up this really nice smokescreen of racism. I mean, it's one thing to be standing up for someone's race and say, hey, we matter, because yes, we all matter. But when you subvert that and you co-opt that and you put it into a Marxist package, that's pretty deceptive. People who are kneeling before these groups really are kneeling before an organization that wants to see their way of life destroyed. So I got news for the kneelers. They don't respect you. They don't accept it. They just see you as weak when you're on your knees. So if you're wondering still, gee, Bobinski, are you right about this? Let's go back to that Washington Times article where Higgins said that Antifa has been planning these attacks at least since last November. And then you go to the World Socialist website, and I've got a link to that in my article as well, which I will provide a link to that article down in the show notes below. But they printed an article on January 3rd that said, it was titled, "The Decade of Socialist Revolution Begins." And in their very first paragraph, it says, "The arrival of the new year marks the beginning of a decade of intensifying class struggle and world socialist revolution." So if that doesn't tell you that they had this planned, then you're not putting dots together very well. And of course, since this is the decade of revolution, you can probably expect them to be also adhering to Saul Alinsky's rule number 8. If you read his book, Rules for Radicals, you found out what a very twisted man he was. But rule number 8 for Saul Alinsky was keep the pressure up, never let up. And that's what they're doing. I think with that mindset, with that understanding, we can expect these riots and all the violence to go into play all the way until the election, and then some. I mean, I think it was Chris Todd on one of the shows even saying last week or two, can we keep the intensity of the racial discrimination fight against until the election? He's basically saying, can we keep it up? So I want you to think for yourself, though. I want you to kind of turn off the media, turn off what you've been listening to while you're driving to and from work or watching the evening news, and just think, do we have systemic racism in America? There's a show host on Fox Sports. He's black. He's up there saying, you know what? I'm black. I don't see systemic racism. I got a black co-host. He actually went through Antifa's, and I'm sorry, Black Lives Matter's mission statement, and he read them to riot act. He says, this is not what I stand for as a black man. So I challenge that statement that we have systemic racism. We are blowing little things up, little pockets up, and saying it's all systemic and whatnot. And you're even racist if you drink white milk. Kind of crazy. I mean, I linked to an article. That's not just me saying that. But think about this for a second. When Trump was elected, he got 8% of the black vote. This past January, Trump was polling 40% among blacks, 40%. Now that's going to vary poll to poll, but anywhere from 30 to 40% support for black. Democrats cannot win with that. And I think that's a big reason why we're seeing the big uprising is the Democrats are behind this. And when I say the Democrats, because actually I shouldn't even say it that way, they're kind of the marionettes of the Marxist globalists anyways. So the whole organization thought, we just cannot have Trump reelected. He's getting in the way of our plans. But listen to this for a second. At the beginning of this year, economic conditions created by Trump's policies gave blacks in the United States the lowest unemployment numbers since records have been kept. Poverty rates for African Americans were at record lows. Legislation was signed by Trump giving historically black colleges and universities new permanent additional funding of $255 million a year. Trump was making national monuments out of historical black sites, such as Camp Nelson, a landmark commemorating contributions of black soldiers in the Civil War. And then the 5 cities in America with the largest black populations saw their median black household income rise substantially. New York, Atlanta, Chicago, Dallas, Washington, D.C. Washington, D.C. had a 7% increase for median black income. Atlanta, 21% increase in median black income. There's just no way the Democrats can win an election when 40% of the blacks are going to vote for Trump. So they had to do something. This is all pushed up. I just want to say, as I've said in previous columns and in previous podcasts, if we're going to kind of survive this, we patriots need to say the time for compromise is over. You guys keep going. The left keeps going crazy. The globalists, the Marxists keep going crazy, making very wild demands. Antifa has their demands. Marxist-Leninist BLM has their demands. We just have to say no. And yes, they're going to say that we're mean for not compromising. But guess what? Immature children always say that adults are mean when adults don't give in to childish demands. So that's just the way it is. One final thought, and this isn't going to change any Marxists' minds because I think their consciences are seared. But if we're going to remain a free country, we need to tell more people what's really going on with BLM and Antifa, that these are not standing up for just racist issues. They are standing up for Marxism. If they really cared about Black Lives Matter, they'd be in Chicago trying to stop all the murders happening there every week. They'd be trying to stop all the babies getting killed by abortions each week because the majority of babies killed in Planned Parenthood clinics are black. So if Black lives really mattered, we wouldn't see people burning down statues like that. So please do share this information with your friends and family. And that's my podcast. This is Daniel Bobinski, and I thank you for listening. This is your opportunity to leave a comment down below if you want. You can also send me an email to newbookofdaniel@outlook.com. On Facebook, you can track me down at New Book of Daniel, just facebook.com/newbookofdaniel. I'm on Twitter and Parler, both at New Book of Daniel. And you can read my blog, newbookofdaniel.com. Of course, you can always read my columns on political issues and news of the day at uncoverdc.com and also at Red State. This has been the New Book of Daniel podcasts. Like I said, this is Daniel Bobinski, and I'll catch you on the next show. Until then, be blessed.